Chrisean Rock is one phone call away from a homicide charge. That is not a rumor. That is not a wild internet whisper. That is a sentence being written by real detectives in a real precinct about a real dead man, and the ink is still wet. Y'all locked in? Because tonight the floor drops out from under one of the loudest women in the culture, and it drops for a reason that is going to leave every single person in this comment section staring at the screen like they just watched a magic trick they cannot unsee. We diving in headfirst tonight, and I'm not going to hold your hand through it. The same afternoon Chrisean Rock told the internet she was packing suitcases and quietly leaving the United States, homicide detectives were already knocking on doors across Baltimore asking her name out loud. Let that land. She said the words, moving out the country on a public stream, and within the same news cycle, badges were in the field asking her associates what they knew. That is not coincidence. That is choreography. And the choreography does not favor Chrisean Rock. Now peep this, because this story doesn't start today, and it doesn't start with a suitcase. It starts with a baby. It starts with a paternity test. It starts with a man named Ronnie who, until very recently, was breathing. Ronnie was the ex-boyfriend of Chrisean Rock, and when Chrisean Rock got pregnant, Ronnie stood up in front of the internet and said the baby is mine. Chrisean Rock said the baby belongs to Blueface. Blueface, from the moment his voice touched a microphone about the child, said the baby is not mine, the baby is Ronnie's. 3 sides of a triangle. 2 of them pointing at Ronnie. One of them, Chrisean Rock herself, pointing everywhere except Ronnie. And Ronnie, being the man he was, did not sit at home and cry into a pillow. Ronnie walked into a courtroom and filed for a paternity test. He wanted the truth stamped by a judge. He wanted his name on a document. He wanted to know if the boy on the internet was the boy in his blood. He wanted, and this is the part every man watching should feel in his ribs, the simple confirmation that the child he had been claiming publicly was actually his. That is not a wild ask. That is the smallest ask a man can make. Here's where the room gets warm. Chrisean Rock did not want that test to happen. That much is not opinion, that much is court record. And Ronnie, understanding exactly what he was up against, did not just wait for a judge. He flew. He drove. He pulled up on Chrisean Rock in person when she rolled into Baltimore, and in a piece of footage that has been circulating for months now, Ronnie stood in her face and said, in front of witnesses, "That's my son, that's my son, that's my son." 3 times. Like a man trying to hammer a truth into concrete. That's my son. Chrisean Rock's response? She called security. She called him a police something under her breath, and she had him walked out the door. She did not deny it. She did not turn around and say the baby is not yours. She had him removed. That is a detail I want you to hold on to, because the way you react to a man who claims your child tells you everything about whether you're afraid of what a test would say. If the baby was not his, the easiest sentence in the English language would have been, the baby is not yours. She did not say that sentence. Chrisean Rock chose escalation over denial. Chrisean Rock chose a security guard over a straight answer. That silence right there is the first fingerprint on the glass. Now here's where the floor drops for the first time. In the next 4 to 6 weeks, per court schedule, Chrisean Rock was going to be legally compelled to take a court-ordered paternity test. 4 to 6 weeks. That was the window. And exactly 1 week before that hearing, Ronnie was sitting in his car outside his own house in Baltimore. It was quiet. It was ordinary. And then a second car pulled up behind him. A shooter got out of the second car, ran up on Ronnie's window, and unloaded. 10 shots. 10. Not 2, not 3, 10. Every neighbor on that street heard it, and every neighbor on that street stayed inside. And here is the part that will sit in your chest for a week. Nobody came outside to check on him for at least 10 minutes. 10 shots. 10 minutes. A father bleeding out in the driver's seat of his own vehicle, 1 week before a paternity test that would have changed everything, and there is not a soul brave enough to walk toward the sound. By the time a neighbor finally crept up to the car, Ronnie was already gone. He was shot up everywhere. There was no saving him. There was nothing left to save. That is the kind of ambush that requires knowledge. That is the kind of ambush that requires timing. That is not a random Baltimore stray. That is a mission. Whoever pulled up behind Ronnie knew where he was, knew when he would be sitting still, and knew he would be alone. That is not a coincidence hit. That is an appointment. Now, when a story like that hits the timeline, the first question anybody with a brain asks is who benefited? Who woke up the next morning with a lighter calendar? Who lost a courtroom obligation the second Ronnie's chest stopped moving? And the honest, unavoidable, unpleasant answer to that question is the same woman who is now packing bags and telling the world she's leaving the country. That is not a headline I invented. That is a straight line of dominoes anyone with two eyes can trace. The court hearing evaporated the moment Ronnie evaporated. The paternity test evaporated the moment Ronnie evaporated. The legal exposure evaporated the moment Ronnie evaporated. And into that quiet vacuum, homicide detectives started walking, badge first, into rooms full of people who know Chrisean Rock personally. That vacuum is doing all the talking now. That vacuum is louder than any interview Chrisean Rock will ever give. That vacuum is what the state of Maryland is currently reading like a book. Now let me pull back, because I do not throw the word murder around casually, and I do not accuse a woman of a killing based on vibes. Everything I am telling you right now is what is on the public record, what has been said on other people's podcasts, and what has been screamed into cameras by people close to this story. This is alleged. Say it with me. Alleged. But watch what happens next, because the word alleged is about to get very heavy. I am not writing an indictment. I am reading a timeline. And a timeline, unlike an accusation, does not need a lawyer to hold it up. A timeline holds itself up. And this timeline is standing on its own 2 feet asking questions nobody in Chrisean Rock's camp has answered yet. The first person to blow the door off this thing was not a cop. It was not a journalist. It was not even an enemy. It was Chrisean Rock's own biological sister. Her actual blood. And she sat down on Jason Lee's podcast, on video, on camera, and when the host asked her what happened to Ronnie, she said, and I want you to hear this carefully, she said she could not speak on it. Because if she spoke on it, it would not look good for certain people that we know. Certain people that we know. That is not a phrase you use about a stranger. That is not a phrase you use about a random street beef. That is a phrase you use when your sibling is standing behind a curtain you refuse to pull open. She said Ronnie ran up on Chrisean Rock in public. She said he had a paternity test coming up. She said it was all online. And then, with a tone I have not heard from a family member on a podcast in a long time, she said, and then pow, pow, pow. She said she fed that boy. Fed him. In her own kitchen. She said they had a real relationship, that it was passionate but not cloudy, and that even after she cut it off there was still love in the room. And then, in the same breath, on the same microphone, she implied that the woman who shares her last name is the reason he is in a casket. Pow, pow, pow. On a public podcast. About her sister's ex. 1 week before a paternity test. If you are still on the fence about whether this story has weight, listen to that clip and come back. Because a sister does not fly out her own blood on national video unless something is boiling under her skin she cannot swallow anymore. Sisters protect sisters. Sisters lie for sisters. Sisters take secrets to the grave for sisters. What sisters do not do, in 9 out of 10 households in America, is sit on a podcast with a professional camera pointed at them and hint that their own flesh and blood may have arranged a homicide. That took something to do. That took a level of anger or grief or moral clarity or fear that the average sibling never reaches. Whatever it was, Chrisean Rock's sister reached it, and the internet has been unable to unhear the sound. Now the natural next question is, well, what did Chrisean Rock say when she got asked about it? And here is where the story turns from suspicious into what I am going to call self-inflicted. Chrisean Rock did an interview. Chrisean Rock, when asked about Ronnie's death, initially blurted out that his trolling put him in a grave. His trolling put him in a grave. Chrisean Rock realized what she said mid-sentence, walked it back, and pivoted to a story about how Ronnie must have had street beef. Street beef. Ronnie was not a street guy the internet had ever heard about. Ronnie was not trolling shooters in Baltimore. Ronnie was not out here running his mouth at killers. The only person Ronnie was publicly trolling on the internet was Chrisean Rock. So when Chrisean Rock says out loud that Ronnie trolled himself into a grave, the only thing that sentence can honestly mean is that trolling her was the offense he paid for. That is not a confession. But it is the closest thing to one you will get out of a woman with a public relations manager. That sentence is going to be replayed in slow motion in every documentary that gets made about this case for the next 20 years. That sentence is a bookmark in the file. And Chrisean Rock did not stop there. When pressed further about Ronnie, she talked about him with a coldness that did not fit a man she had once been intimate with. She talked about him like he was a mosquito she had swatted. She said if he had lived, if he had really been a father option, his family was good, his mother was good, his grandmother was good, and honestly she would have preferred him over Blueface. But then, in the same breath, she said Ronnie only claimed the baby because he was tripping. He was tripping. That is how Chrisean Rock described a dead man who spent his last months in a courtroom trying to reach a child he believed was his. He was tripping. Cold does not begin to cover that. There is a way you talk about a person you had a child with, even if that child turns out not to be yours, even if the relationship burned to the ground, even if there is not a shred of love left in the memory. There is a floor of humanity human beings observe. Chrisean Rock did not observe that floor. Chrisean Rock walked past the floor and kept going into the basement. Now, one voice does not build a homicide case. So let me stack another voice on the pile. Blueface. Blueface of all people. The man who has been in a public war with Chrisean Rock for years. Blueface came home from a jail stretch, sat down on the same Jason Lee and Blueface, when asked directly if he thought Chrisean Rock had anything to do with Ronnie's death, said the following. He said the night Ronnie was killed, Ronnie and Chrisean Rock were on the phone. That was his phrase. On the phone. He said the red flag for him was somebody publicly declaring after a homicide that the deceased had called them right before it happened. That does not sit right with him. He said Chrisean Rock is known in his experience to be a setup artist. Setup artist. He said she has dropped addresses before. He said she moves impulsively, in the spur of the moment, and once she decides on a target, she does not stop. And listen, Blueface has his own history, Blueface has his own controversies, but the man was under oath of his own reputation when he said what he said, and what he said adds a phone call to a timeline that already stinks. When your ex says setup artist on a podcast that reaches 10 million people, that is not banter. That is testimony dressed in casual clothes. Let me count with you what we have. Sister on the record. Ex on the record. A paternity test 1 week away. A murder that erased that test. A shooter who ran up on Ronnie so quickly and so professionally that 10 rounds were emptied before a single neighbor cracked a door. A cold public statement from the woman at the center of it, all describing the victim as a troll who dug his own grave. And a sudden, unannounced, out-of-nowhere decision to leave the country. If I put that in front of a jury tomorrow, that jury does not need a lunch break. That jury does not need a coffee. That jury walks into the room, reads the pile, walks back out, and hands the bailiff a verdict card. That is the pile Chrisean Rock is currently standing on top of. But the floor drops again. Because it just got heavier. A new witness has walked into the story. A man in Baltimore has come forward publicly, and I mean on camera, and I mean on his own accord, and stated that homicide detectives are asking him about Ronnie's murder and, more specifically, asking him about his relationship to Chrisean Rock. That is not a leak. That is not a rumor. That is a live man in front of a camera announcing that he has been contacted by a homicide unit and scheduled for an interview. He said the detectives specifically asked him about Chrisean Rock. Not Ronnie's other friends. Not Ronnie's alleged street beef. Chrisean Rock. That is the name they came knocking with. When homicide comes to your door with one name in their mouth, that is the name they are building the file around. That is not fishing. That is targeting. And the target they named out loud, in a Baltimore apartment, in the middle of an unsolved murder investigation, was Chrisean Rock. Now, I want to pause here, because I am not going to sit up here and pretend that witness is a saint. The man got on the internet and announced his own police interview to the world, which is not exactly the move of someone with a plan. He talked about it. He live-streamed it. He described the day the detectives came to his door and the day he is scheduled to talk to them. He said, in his own words, they see through what he is doing, they see through the trolling, they see through everything, but they still want to talk. And then, and this is the part that makes me lean back in my chair, he said your girl might be in trouble. Your girl might be in trouble. He said Chrisean Rock might be going down. He said Ronnie has been in the ground long enough that the fact detectives are only now knocking has to mean one thing, they are building. And he said it not with fear, not with sorrow, but with a kind of casual excitement that made every viewer of that live stream slightly nauseous. Because if he really has information, broadcasting it before you sit down with the badge is not smart, it is dangerous. People who talk that loud in the middle of an unsolved murder investigation tend to have short shelf lives. And that adds another layer of tension to a story that is already vibrating. They are building. That is the phrase. When homicide detectives take their time, when a case sits open, when the badge goes quiet, it is because they are collecting. And when they finally start knocking, it is because they are ready. That is the point of the investigation Chrisean Rock is now standing on top of. And that is the point of the investigation Chrisean Rock is now, allegedly, trying to fly away from. Because timing tells a story of its own. Cases like this do not sit dormant unless the detectives are stacking. They're stacking phone records. They're stacking cell tower pings. They're stacking financial transfers. They're stacking witness statements. And then, when the stack is high enough, they start asking questions in the open, and the moment they start asking questions in the open is the moment the subject of the investigation has roughly one news cycle to make a decision. Let me pattern seal something for you, because I want you to understand this is not a first-time whisper around Chrisean Rock. Ronnie himself, before he was killed, was arrested for a shooting connected to Chrisean Rock. Ronnie caught a case for a violent incident that traced back to Chrisean Rock's world. And Chrisean Rock's own brother is currently sitting in a prison cell serving time for murder. Not a rumor, not a message board, a documented sentence. So we are not talking about a woman who is a stranger to gunfire. We are not talking about a woman who has never had violence in her orbit. We are talking about a woman who moves inside an ecosystem where problems have historically been solved with bullets and where people around her, willingly or unwillingly, have been the ones pulling triggers. That is the environment Ronnie walked into when he filed that paternity petition. That is the environment Ronnie was sitting in when a second car pulled up behind his and unloaded 10 times. That is not victim blaming. That is not saying Ronnie deserved anything that happened to him. Ronnie was a father trying to reach his son. But the world Chrisean Rock operates in was, provably, a world where somebody in her circle, at any given moment, has been willing to pull a trigger for her. And here is the sentence I want to sit inside for a minute. Ronnie was 1 week from a courtroom that would have permanently settled the question of whether Chrisean Jr. is his son. 1 week. If that test had happened, and if that test had come back positive, the entire public narrative Chrisean Rock has built around this child collapses. The Blueface angle collapses. The custody story collapses. The image collapses. The court's opinion of Chrisean Rock's honesty collapses. Every subsequent legal proceeding involving that child becomes a hostile environment for Chrisean Rock. 1 week from a courtroom that could have vaporized her public story, Ronnie was killed. If you are still telling yourself the timing is coincidence, I don't know what to do for you. That is not a duck. That is a whole flock. And every one of those ducks is quacking the same word, and that word rhymes with jury. Now let me talk to you about the suitcase. Because the suitcase is not decorative. Chrisean Rock got on her own live stream, on her own platform, with her own baby in the background, and announced she is moving out of the country. She would not say where. She would not say when. She would not say why. She said it laughing. She said it with a grin. She said we ain't going to tell y'all details, but we're moving. Y'all know what that reads like on paper the same week homicide detectives are working her name? That reads like flight. That reads like a woman who has been advised by somebody, somewhere, that the ground she is standing on is about to shake. That reads like a woman who understands that if she leaves before the paperwork lands, extradition becomes a headache instead of a formality. Countries without extradition treaties with the United States are a small list, and every person in the culture who has ever tried to disappear onto that list knows what it means. It means once you land, you are much harder to get back. It means the American court system has to negotiate with a foreign government. It means, in most practical scenarios, you buy yourself years. Chrisean Rock did not choose that language accidentally. Chrisean Rock chose that language on camera, in front of her own audience, and let it land exactly where it landed. I want to be careful here. I want to be surgical. I am not the badge. I am not the courtroom. I am not the one who gets to say the word guilty. What I am is a man who reads timelines for a living, and this timeline reads like a novel. Motive there. Means around her. Opportunity. A phone call the night of. Consciousness of guilt, a suitcase and a plane ticket. Corroborating witness, her own sister. Corroborating witness, her ex-corroborating witness, a man scheduled for a homicide interview. Every rail of a case is on the tracks. The only thing missing is the moment when a prosecutor decides the pile is high enough to file. And prosecutors, contrary to what the internet thinks, do not file the moment a case is winnable. Prosecutors file the moment a case is unlosable. That is why homicide investigations of high-profile subjects take months and sometimes years. The prosecutor is building a case that survives a jury of 12 strangers and a defense team of $10,000 an hour. When they file because the file is armored. Now, here is where I have to slow you down. Because I owe it to Chrisean Rock, and I owe it to the audience, and I owe it to Ronnie's memory to say this the correct way. This is alleged. Chrisean Rock has not been charged with anything. Chrisean Rock has not been named a suspect on any public filing. Chrisean Rock has not been arrested. It is completely possible, it is genuinely, plausibly possible, that Chrisean Rock had nothing to do with Ronnie's death. It is completely possible that Ronnie had a private conflict none of us know about. It is completely possible that the timing is the most horrific coincidence of the year. That door is still open. I am not the one closing it. But I am asking you, honestly, viewer to viewer, how many coincidences does it take before you stop calling them coincidences? 10? 20? 100? Because we are already past 10. We are already past 20. We are stacking coincidence on top of coincidence like Jenga blocks, and the tower is swaying. Because I want to remind you what this whole thing was supposed to be about at the beginning. This was never a beef about a mixtape. This was never a war over a live stream. This was one father, walking into a courthouse, asking for a piece of paper that would tell him whether the baby crying on his phone screen shares his blood. That is the smallest, quietest, most ordinary request a man can make. He did not ask for custody. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for control. He asked for a test. And a week before that test was going to happen, a bullet, 10 bullets, ended the question. That is not a small tragedy. That is a life-defining tragedy for everyone standing around this story, including a little boy who now grows up without one of the two men who wanted him. Ronnie will never meet Chrisean Jr. Ronnie will never hold him. Ronnie will never know for a documented, court-stamped fact whether that baby was his blood. Ronnie died with the question in his mouth. And that, more than anything else in this whole story, is the sentence that keeps me awake at night. And that brings me to the part of this whole thing that keeps me up. Chrisean Jr. Because whatever happens next in a courtroom, whatever badge shows up at Chrisean Rock's door, whatever plane she gets on, whatever headline breaks tomorrow, there is a baby in the middle of this. And that baby did not sign up for any of it. Blueface is not claiming him. Ronnie is buried. Chrisean Rock is packing suitcases. If Chrisean Rock walks into a jail cell, that baby walks into a system. If Chrisean Rock flies out the country, that baby flies with her into a place with fewer records, fewer eyes, and fewer protections. There is a small human being at the exact center of this hurricane, and nobody in the storm seems interested in shielding him. That is the sentence that should stop this whole conversation cold. This story is not about a rapper. It is about a child. Chrisean Jr. did not get to pick his parents. Chrisean Jr. did not get to pick his last name. Chrisean Jr. did not get to pick the hurricane he was born into. And every single second, the adults around Chrisean Jr. spend fighting each other online, streaming their beefs, and boarding planes to unknown destinations is a second Chrisean Jr. spends unstable. You know how the room feels about Chrisean Rock over here. I have been vocal on this channel. I have been consistent on this channel. I have not liked the way she has moved as a mother. I have not liked the way she has moved as a partner. I have not liked the way she has moved as a public figure. But I want to be crystal clear right now, because it matters. You can dislike a woman's parenting and still refuse to convict her of a murder she did not commit. I am not out here trying to slam a cell door on Chrisean Rock. I am not out here trying to write a rap sheet in her name. I am out here trying to walk you through a timeline that has walked itself into every homicide detective's inbox in Baltimore. What Chrisean Rock is going to do next is up to Chrisean Rock. What the state of Maryland is going to do next is up to Maryland. What I am doing is showing you what showed up on the public record, in the public podcasts, in the public court filings, in the public statements of family members who share her last name. My job is not to sentence her. My job is to hand you the evidence pile that the internet has been assembling in slow motion and step back so you can read it with your own eyes. And what showed up is not comfortable. What showed up is a woman standing on top of a homicide investigation with a suitcase in her hand, an ex on the phone the night the trigger got pulled, a sister on a podcast pointing without pointing, a new witness scheduled for a police interview, and a paternity test that vanished the same week its subject did. That is not a story I invented. That is a story that has been writing itself in public for months, and it just walked itself into a homicide unit's evidence folder. If it turns out Chrisean Rock had nothing to do with any of this, I will be the first man on this platform to look into the lens and say I was wrong, because that is what you do. But if it turns out she did, if this ends the way the dominoes are currently pointing, this is going to be the biggest hip-hop courtroom story of the decade. And every single person who dismissed it back in month 1 is going to be scrolling their own comments in silence. Let me widen the lens one more time, because there is a bigger picture here that most people are missing. Chrisean Rock did not become Chrisean Rock in a vacuum. Chrisean Rock became a brand because millions of people watched her toxicity on repeat and rewarded her with attention. Every fight, every meltdown, every public scream match with Blueface, every impulsive live stream where she said something that would have ended a normal celebrity's career, we ate it up. The culture built Chrisean Rock in the culture's own image. And now that same culture is looking at a Baltimore homicide file with Chrisean Rock's name attached to it, and it does not know how to feel. Some viewers want her locked up. Some viewers want her protected. Some viewers want her to disappear into a country where none of us have to think about her again. And the truth is that all three of those reactions come from the same place, a viewership that fed the beast for years and now does not know what to do with the beast standing over a body. That is a spiritual problem. That is a cultural problem. That is not going to be solved by a jail cell or an acquittal. Because if Chrisean Rock disappears from the timeline tomorrow, another Chrisean Rock will show up on Monday, and we will do it all over again. That is the meta story sitting behind this one. The Chrisean Rock story is not a Chrisean Rock story. It is a mirror. And what the mirror is showing right now is not flattering, not for her, not for Ronnie's memory, not for that baby, and not for anybody scrolling this comment section right now who watched her toxicity for entertainment. But let me pull back to the case, because I know that is why you clicked. Where does this go from here? Here is the honest, boring, non-clickbait answer, nowhere fast. Homicide investigations of this profile take months. Grand juries do not move in days. Extradition, if she leaves, takes years. The internet is going to want an arrest by next Tuesday, and the internet is going to be disappointed for approximately 6 to 9 months, while paperwork moves through channels the average viewer will never see. But make no mistake, the paperwork is moving. The moment a witness announces his own homicide interview on a live stream, the case is no longer sitting in a filing cabinet. It is being actively worked. And when a case is being actively worked and the subject of that case boards a plane to a country with no extradition treaty, prosecutors move faster. They move faster than they otherwise would. They move faster because flight is a factor that changes the calculation. Chrisean Rock, by publicly announcing her exit, may have accelerated her own timeline. That is a mistake if she made it consciously. That is a mistake if her people advised it. That is a mistake if she was told to lay low and instead did the opposite. Because there is a version of this story where Chrisean Rock, if she is innocent, was going to be quietly cleared in 6 months when the detectives finished their work and concluded she was not the connective tissue. That is a version of this story a good attorney would have engineered. Sit still. Say nothing. Let the badge do its work. Emerge unscathed. That version is now off the table. That version is off the table because Chrisean Rock chose loud. Chrisean Rock chose Suitcase. Chrisean Rock chose moving out the country as a public statement in the same week detectives were dialing her name. Innocent people do not choose that language. Innocent people, in the same news cycle, would have chosen silence, a lawyer, and an ordinary domestic life. Chrisean Rock chose the exit door on livestream. That is not the move of someone who thinks she has nothing to worry about. And that brings us back to the suitcase. To the suitcase, and to the baby, and to the phone call, and to the sister, and to the ex, and to the witness, and to the 10 shots, and to the 10 minutes, and to the paternity test that never happened, and to a father who is not going to see his son grow up. That is the picture. That is the whole picture. And every piece of that picture points, allegedly, in the same direction. So I need y'all to talk to me in the replies. Talk to me right now. Where do you stand? Are you looking at this timeline the way I am looking at it, or are you seeing a coincidence I am not seeing? Do you think Chrisean Rock actually pulled a string here, or do you think she is a woman with a bad reputation being crushed under the weight of a story she did not write? Do you think that baby, Chrisean Jr., ends up safe? Or do you think that baby ends up as another chapter in a story nobody in this bloodline knows how to close? Do you think the homicide unit files inside the next 6 months, or do you think this drags into next year and the year after? Do you think she boards the plane before the badge knocks? Do you think Blueface finally steps up and claims the baby, or does that door stay closed forever? Drop it in the box. I read every one, and the next update video is coming the second anything new hits the wire. Because make no mistake, this is not the end of this story. Detectives do not knock on doors to ask questions they already have answers to. Detectives knock on doors when they have decided a decision is about to be made. And when that decision is made, whether it is a filing, an arrest, a search warrant, a subpoena, the news cycle will explode. When it does, be locked in with me. Be here. Because you are going to want to hear it from the room that has been telling you what was under the floorboards from day one. Stay 10 toes with me. Stay in the replies. Stay honest. And if you rocked with this breakdown, if this made 100 pieces click into place for you, hit that like, hit that subscribe, and tell the next person in your group chat where to find this. Because when a story of this size finally breaks, you want to be the one who saw it coming. You do not want to be the one hearing it late. You do not want to be the person in the barbershop 3 months from now, watching everybody argue about Chrisean Rock's arrest and realizing you missed the video that laid the whole thing out before the world caught up. That is where we stand tonight. That is what the timeline looks like. That is what the evidence pile looks like. That is what the witnesses are saying. A father who wanted a paternity test is buried in Baltimore. A mother who did not want that test is packing suitcases in public. A sister with the same blood is on a national podcast saying pow pow pow. An ex is on the record about a phone call. A witness is on the record about a homicide interview. And a baby, a real breathing baby, is at the center of a hurricane the internet built and refuses to stop feeding. Chrisean Rock could be arrested any day now. Or Chrisean Rock could vanish into a country with no extradition treaty and never be arrested at all. Either version of this story is a tragedy. Either version of this story is a headline the culture is going to be reading about for years. I hope, sincerely, for that baby's sake, that the ending here is the softest ending possible. But hope is not a plan, and hope is not a defense, and hope does not close a homicide file. Hope did not save Ronnie. Hope will not save Chrisean Rock. And hope, on its own, is not going to save that baby either. What saves that baby is somebody in a courtroom, somebody in a family, somebody in a system, making a hard decision about what a stable childhood looks like when both of the men who fought over you are gone or absent. One last piece before we close. I want you to think about the phone call. Not the theory of the phone call, not the podcast reference to the phone call, the actual mechanics of it. Blueface said Ronnie and Chrisean Rock were on the phone the night Ronnie died. That is not a small detail. That is a phone record. That is a cell tower ping. That is a timestamp on a carrier server that no defense attorney in the country can delete. If Chrisean Rock and Ronnie were in fact on that phone the night Ronnie was executed in his own car, that record exists in a Verizon or AT&T database right now, and it exists whether Chrisean Rock cooperates with detectives or not. That is a piece of evidence that does not need her permission to enter the courtroom. That is a piece of evidence that walks in on its own two legs. And that is the piece of evidence that, more than any sister's podcast quote and more than any witness's live stream, will decide the direction this case takes when the district attorney sits down to read the file. Chrisean Rock cannot outrun a phone record. Chrisean Rock cannot fly a phone record to a non-extradition country. Chrisean Rock cannot delete a phone record by moving out the country. And that, my friend, is why the ground under her feet is shaking harder tonight than it was yesterday. Talk to me. I'm going to be right here. And when the next domino falls, and it is going to fall, you will hear about it in this room first. Stay 10 toes. Stay locked in. Peace.